Good morning, and welcome to Auburn University's McCrary Institute. My name is Cheri Caddy, and I'm a Senior Cybersecurity Fellow. If viewers have any questions for the panel, please submit them in the comment section on YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter. Today, we're going to talk about a cybersecurity issue that's receiving an increasing amount of attention: supply chain security for globally sourced technology. In December, the world learned of cybersecurity problems with the SolarWinds Orion software, which was attacked by compromising the software supply chain. In the 4 short months since then, we've only seen more of the same. Hafnium, and in just last week, Password State. All of these have compromised supply chain integrity. Supply chain concerns for globally sourced software, firmware, and digital components are not new, but use of this vector for compromise has been accelerating. Starting in 2018, the US federal government began a policy shift by naming for the first time digital products from specific companies in legislation as prohibited in federal networks. These included products from Kaspersky Labs, certain products from Chinese companies in the National Defense Authorization Act. However, the government lacked an effective means to determine if such digital high risk components were embedded in technology being purchased by the US government, directing prime vendors and original equipment manufacturers to be accountable for the security of all of their sub-tier suppliers in the global digital supply chain is really difficult to achieve. The new administration has signaled its focus on supply chain security by issuing a new executive order on America's supply chains in February. Public reports have hinted at more policy actions to come in response to the SolarWinds compromise. I'm honored today to have some of the best supply chain experts in government and industry here today to talk about and illuminate ways to illuminate digital supply chain risk and the prospect of using a bill of materials approach to address this important problem. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves and their background and talk about their perspectives on this issue. First, I'd like to go to Allan. Allan, please.
Thank you so much, Cheri, and thank you everyone for joining us. It's an honor to be here with such an illustrious panel. As a bit of background, I self-identify as a failed academic who got talked into joining government about 6.5 years ago. And at NTIA, at the Department of Commerce, we think about how the government can help sort of catalyze better market change. So we talk about a market failure in security. We know that solutions have to come from the marketplace. How can the government help drive some action? And what NTI has been working on for the last 2.5 years is something called the Software Bill of Materials. The idea that we all benefit if we have greater transparency into the software supply chain. So first, we're just looking at software. And second, this is the initial step. This is just know what you have. I like to say if you go to the store and you buy a Twinkie because you're in the mood for a non-biodegradable snack, it will come with a list of ingredients. Why don't we expect that bare minimum amount of information for the software that's running in our critical infrastructure? Now, we think this isn't too heavy a lift, and it has a lot of great benefits for the ecosystem. So when we say a list of ingredients for software, what do we mean? Well, software is not hewn out of alabaster by tonsured monks on Greek islands, right? It's assembled. It's assembled out of other pieces of software, which are in turn assembled by other pieces of software. And some people do that very, very well and very carefully, and other people do it a little less well and a little less carefully. And some of that, as software ages, right? There's a fun discussion analogy. It says software often ages like milk rather than like wine. And really, a lot of the risk is the components that we're using in software. And so we need to make sure that we know what's in there for monitoring. So what do we need? We don't need that much information. We need to say, hey, if you can imagine software as a tree. So I'm using this component, which in turn is using this component, which is in turn using this component. And so what do we need from each element in that tree? Well, I need to know who the supplier is, what the component name is, what's the version, right? So is it an up-to-date version? Is it a fresh ingredient or is it a stale ingredient? And then ideally some mathematical hash so that you and I can be certain that we're talking about the same component. And then what's the source of the data, right? Did it come from my immediate supplier? Did it come from the open source directory? Did it come from a third-party security company that's helping me out? So that's not that much information. And we think that over time, this will be a write once process where the first time we do it, it'll be a one-time cost, but over time we'll be able to do this. But how are we going to do it? We didn't want to create a brand new technical standard if we're trying to promote adoption. And in fact, there are already some data formats out there in the marketplace today that were ready to convey this data. And so what we've tried to do at NTIA is to bring together different parts of the community to say, how do we make sure that these data formats are compatible and interoperable so that we don't have a standards fight on our hand and we can actually say, it's not the government's job to pick a winner or loser. We're going to focus on interoperability. And then we want to focus on implementation. What does it actually mean to make this scale? For this to work properly, it needs to be machine readable. It needs to be something that we can actually have interoperability across the ecosystem. Now, there are some fun challenges as we go from taking this idea into the software supply chain. But it's important to acknowledge, hey, why aren't we doing this already? Right? If this is such a good idea, why don't we have this? Now, some of those reasons, I think, are perhaps less than purely practical, such as not everyone used to take as much care with their open source licenses as they should have. And so people were reluctant to sort of share what types of open source software they were using. I think today that's a much better understood risk. There are commercial off-the-shelf tools that help you manage it. It's something that every corporate risk officer knows about. Almost every startup that I've talked to has knows that they're going to have to go through an open source audit. So some of these concerns we understand a lot better today. On the other hand, some of these challenges we actually need to sort of work through. How do we think about, for example, getting the data down the supply chain? Well, Chris is going to talk about that in a little bit. And a lot of it is really just focusing on saying, are the assumptions we have in the data models valid? And so one of the things we've tried to do over the last few years is emphasize a proof of concept model where we're working with both suppliers and customers to say, can you generate the data and can the customers consume it? And the great news is the early results have been, yes, we can do this. And we're seeing more and more enthusiasm for this idea of a software bill of materials. And we think it's going to take off. NTIA's job here is to help communities understand what it means for them. What we want to do is harmonize this across different sectors while still allowing flexibility for different communities to figure out how they can make their own.
Great, thanks, Allan. Really interesting work. As we all know, software is globally sourced, but also a lot of the technology, the physical chips and components, and we need to ensure the integrity of those as well. Ginger, could you tell us about yourself and your work in this area?
I can. Good morning, and thank you, Cheri. I'm Virginia Wright, Ginger, and I'm a program manager at the Idaho National Laboratory focused on energy cybersecurity products for INL's CyberCore organization. I am fortunate to lead a program called Citrix. Citrix stands for Cyber Testing for Resilient Industrial Control Systems. Citrix is a program that leverages Idaho National Laboratory's expertise in testing operational technology, which comes of years of working with vendors to find vulnerabilities in operational technology and get them mitigated for asset owners. We were able to explore that although there are mature systems for detecting vulnerabilities and coordinating those with vendors, there were not mature systems for determining if common components in industrial control systems actually led to these vulnerabilities being exploitable across multiple platforms and multiple vendors. And the Citrix program is designed to look at that, to understand where those common components might be, especially those that are frequently used across energy sector applications, and to specifically address vulnerabilities that stem from those common components in partnership with vendors. This program has been operational and funded by DOE's CSER organization for about 3 years. And we have done multiple tests. I'm proud to say that we have partnerships with 3 different operational technology vendors, including Hitachi ABB, Schneider Electric, and Schweitzer Engineering. Through those partnerships, we routinely test equipment provided by those manufacturers and provide them insights about both vulnerabilities, and we help them enumerate the hardware and software components that comprise those devices so that we can then look for those common components that may be the common source of vulnerabilities. With these partnerships, one of the things that we hope to do is work with the energy sector to understand how software bills of materials and hardware bills of materials might aid asset owners in their risk management for the assets that they procure. And we're partnering with NTIA to have a proof of concept where asset owners and vendors and interested third parties who produce, analyze, and improve bills of materials can work together for the best possible tailoring of the capabilities that Allan has been developing for the energy sector. So we look forward to talking more about that in this panel.
Great. Thanks, Ginger. Could I turn now to Chris, if you could talk about yourself and what you've been working on at Unisys?
You could. So thank you to my fellow panelists and to the McCrary Institute for bringing me into this conversation. I am the Director of Applied Innovation at Unisys, and I'll bring up two other hats in this context. I'm the chair of the International Association of Certified Information Sharing and Analysis Centers, which is an acronym from hell, and as well as the Linux Foundation DBOM Consortium, which will get officially launched later this year. And I look at things like this in the terms of inevitability curves. So I've been doing cybersecurity for about 30 years in IT and OT, and many things have a time. Supply chain security, as Ginger and Allan and Cheri have all touched on already, is coming to a point, and anybody following the software bill of material part of this will see this happening. We see just this week the Department of Homeland Security putting software bill of materials in an official guidance document. We see all the motion on the vendor side and in the DOE, as Ginger has touched on, and in all sorts of other sectors, in semiconductors and in finance and in manufacturing, where the need to know contents of things, particularly cyber right now, but more than cyber, as we focus on software bill of materials, we see the inevitability of that coming to pass, where in this calendar year and in next calendar year and over the next several calendar years, software bill of materials get built into operational processes all over the place. It's the combination, as Allan had touched on, what the digital bill of materials has focused on is how we aggregate artifacts of attestation like a software bill of materials. As Ginger, you touched on, it may be from the vendor, it may be from an enhancement partner, it may be something developed internally, but it's an attestation about the contents of a piece of software. In an operational perspective, when we look at the inevitabilities, in the future, we will be able to say this piece of hardware with this piece of software, with these patches, in this context, with this behavior, with this threat intelligence, therefore falls down a path of action regarding how I manage that, that artifact. So we find ourselves now in supply chain because of the pandemic itself, which is disrupted global supply chains, the Suez Canal, the SolarWinds issue, looking at things that people like Allan, like Kate Stewart at the Linux Foundation, others have been working on for a long time. We find ourselves now at this point where we can adopt artifacts like software bill of materials. And as we get into applying those, the digital bill of materials, which I'll describe really shortly for passing back to Cheri, we think will be used as the attestation ecosystem. So the DBOM code was created by Unisys. It was open source last December. That allows anyone to stand up a node, an attestation node, and participate in channels. So as we go through POCs, like with Ginger and Citrix, we expect that these channels will get chained together so that people will find that the software bill of materials that they have the right to have access to with the hardware bill of materials they have right access to and the information they have can be combined for the operational purposes of cybersecurity and supply chain security, and overarching just efficiency in supply chains to allow us to adopt the Industry 4.0 and other aspects of this era. So Cheri, with that.
Great, Chris, that's a lot. But there's always the details of implementation. And I know, Edna, you've been working in supply chain for a long time with a lot of major companies. Tell us about yourself and your thoughts on supply chain illumination and how to do it.
Thank you so very much. It's certainly both a professional and personal privilege to be here with all of you. And Microsoft's really keen on this particular issue, and we're delighted to have a seat at the table. I have the privilege of serving as the Vice President and Chief Security and Risk Officer for Microsoft's intelligent cloud platform, Azure. And as Cheri pointed out, for over 4 decades now, I've been thinking about these issues. And I think that we're at an inflection point. Chris said something intriguing. And some days you want to think about the fact that everything has its moment in time, right? And a number of us have worked on issues, and we all look at each other and say, why is it that the world hasn't figured out that there are supply chains? Where I come from, only God made something from nothing. The rest of us have had supply chains from time immemorial. But we are thinking about it in a new light. And that new light really says we certainly want to encourage visibility and information sharing. In fact, I've had the privilege of co-chairing government activity with Cheri and with some others, thinking about information sharing to reduce supply chain risk, not just security risk, but supply chain overall. Where we find ourselves today, I think, is with, as always, a discrepancy in how different enterprises and different government agencies approach this and the maturity of each of them. Most folks would think that if you're going to bake a cake, you need to have the recipe or the bill of materials. If you need eggs, you need to know whether it's eggs. If it's flourless, you need to know that you don't need flour. So we at Microsoft, and I've spent 20 years at Cisco, we've had very sophisticated bills of material for a very long time. It's how you drive quality, how you drive consistency, and quite frankly, how you drive innovation with the third-party community. What I think Allan has done that's remarkably unique is identify something, which is we need to say in a risk-based approach, what is the type of software that we care about at this level? So a risk-based approach. What is the type of software that we care about at a different level? We certainly care about all of it, but we care about each element of it in a different way. And what is the scope of information that we need to share with regard to the elements of our software? And that is at modules and at some point line by line in terms of code. And then what Chris has been focused on, and Ginger, I'm learning what you're doing real time here today, I think is a set of meaningful ways to actually vet that, share it in a safe manner, but share it in a meaningful way with integrity. So I think our challenge is not embracing the concept of bills of material. It's what do we need to share, for what, with whom, and how.
No, I think that's a great perspective, Edna, and that sort of leads into the next set of questions I'd like to explore. If I think as everyone has alluded to, that the concept of illuminating with the bill of materials approach is really at an inflection point. I think we have an emerging consensus that this, can be a really strong way to get after these supply chain illumination problems we've been wrestling with for a long time. But how to make this concept work once we have that agreement, the details of how to implement, and if you're really talking about supporting commercial transactions at scale, how does this scale? What are some of the implementation details that we need to work through? And I know, as Allan and Ginger have alluded to, a proof of concept approach seems to be an emerging way to work through those details. So Allan, if I could ask you to tell us a little bit about some of your proof of concept work that you've done with some of the critical infrastructure sectors.
Sure, thank you. And we'll start off with what's the fairly straightforward side of things, because this is actually an area that when you build software, it is almost impossible in the technical process of building the software to not have the data about what the pieces you're using is. So this is something that Edna talked about. Hardware bills of materials, and Ginger talked about hardware bills of materials. You got to trace that stuff back, especially if you care about the pedigree and provenance. But if you're just saying, what library am I using? Well, that's something that's going to be part of your technology. And by the way, fun fact, in some ways, this is actually an easier challenge for a smaller or newer company than it is for a larger, more established organization. Often they have, because the large organizations have built out very sophisticated custom build processes, so changing them can be a little trickier. Can be a little more time intensive, require more investment. Whereas if you're a small organization or a new organization, you're using some commercial off-the-shelf tools where we can slot these capacities in, and we're already seeing them. So in some ways, the basics of it fairly straightforward. So what are some of the challenges? Well, I'll highlight two. One of which is going to be sort of a broader systemic challenge, and the other one is going to require further innovation. The broader systematic challenge is the question of software identity. How do we refer to a specific piece of software? Well, it turns out that namespaces are a very hard problem in technology, because when you're dealing with computers, if you have an underscore rather than a dash, well, that makes matching a hard problem. And so, I use the example, if you're using Java, do you refer to it as com.sun.java because it was originally developed by Sun, or com.oracle.java because Oracle bought Sun? And again, you and I can tell the same piece of software, but a computer has a hard time doing that matching. And so one of the things that we need to do is to think about this notion of a namespace. This isn't an area where we can solve it unilaterally or just dictate everyone do a solution, because it's not that there aren't any solutions, but that there are a few too many solutions. And so something we need to do, and we are working with a bunch of different related efforts, is to try to harmonize this, identify the path to convergence. So one new hard and fast rule we're trying to promote is to say, please don't invent a new name for a piece of software. If you're using someone else's software, use some other string, some other identifier, so that at least we have a path to convergence. So that's one example. Another operational challenge gets to the idea that not everything that's vulnerable upstream actually affects me today. And there are going to be some vulnerabilities where you're like, hey, listen, the whole giant component has vulnerability in it, but I'm using a completely different part of that piece of software. And so how do we avoid transparency causing panic from what we might think of as false positives? Because a naive use of this data is just going to light up a bunch of dashboards and prevent us from focusing on the very real vulnerabilities that exist in almost every major piece of software today. And so one of the things that we're working on in parallel to the idea of SBOM is the idea that we can have security advisories that don't just say, my product is vulnerable, but we can have security vulnerabilities that say, my product is not vulnerable. And I'll give one last fun example about how this relates to things even outside SBOM. I've talked to the heads of product security from some of the biggest companies in the world, and almost all of them have been asked, are you affected by SolarWinds? Does SolarWinds affect you? And their response is one of incredulity. No, that's a completely different company. That's not my software. How would that affect us? What we want to do is enable an automated, scalable way to allow organizations to say, this vulnerability does not affect my piece of software. And then we'll figure out how people learn to trust it. Certainly when Edna says something like that, everyone will listen. When Chris says something like that, well, we'll have to work on that.
No, great points all. And I think you've alluded to, a lot of the details that need to be worked through to make this a really viable and scalable solution. Ginger, could you talk to us a little bit about the energy sector proof of concept and some of the key issues that you're trying to work through in that?
Sure. We have just kicked off an energy sector proof of concept, and we are gathering, as I said before, vendors who make infrastructure technology products and put them into the market, asset owners who leverage those products, and a great many of the third-party integrators who make those products better, synthesize, provide security for the overall architecture, to explore software bills of materials. So with anyone coming together, some of the good parts are everyone is bringing a different perspective for how the software and ultimately hardware bills of materials might improve their ability to make risk management decisions. Our proof of concept is going to allow people who are well-versed in the technologies and the capabilities that NTIA has been developing to partner with people who are brand new to these ideas, for whom an SBOM might be a new concept. and certainly who may not have worked out exactly how they are going to consume this technology, even though they can see the use cases where it may be helpful. So we're going to work first setting aside a group that would actually like to produce and consume software bills of materials, vendors who are interested in sharing this information with asset owners who are interested in consuming it, and figure out what lessons we learned from having them distill software bills of materials and potentially hardware bills of materials and consume those on the other side. What questions can we answer? What questions go unanswered? And where might those third-party suppliers be helpful in reducing the burden on the asset owner to completely understand the entire picture of where the components came from and what the ultimate risk envelope is for the given infrastructure? This process is going to take a while, and we're trying to make this not a completely teaching situation where these folks come and they learn what the NTIA has been doing. We're trying to make it very much a learn by doing. And so that's going to mean that while we have these asset owners and vendors in highly protected conversations, we also need to have the entire group of interested parties working along with some safe classroom style examples where they can construct their own software bill of materials and experience themselves some of the complexity that comes as a result, some of the naming issues that Allan spoke about. And they can explore where a component may have a vulnerability where we find within a product it isn't reachable. And so that vulnerability can't be manifested on infrastructure, so that they understand what that means and can conceptualize it as they think about how to apply this technology. This is one where it's easy to get very excited and connect a lot of dots, but the experiential learning is going to be important. Also, there is the need for prioritization. And this community will have some deep conversations, as we've talked about already, about where these extreme exchanges are important and how much detail is important and where a more surface level treatment might work. We will also explore where does an asset owner need the complete software bill of materials and where could ideas for escrow or having third parties understand the completeness of the software or hardware bill of material. And as I'm sure Chris will talk about, having those third parties help the asset owners with attestations of where vulnerabilities might apply, where subcomponents might reside. So that's going to be a large area for this proof of concept team to explore. We're starting to break the work up into smaller pieces and get our program of work organized, and we invite anyone who's interested to come join us.
Great, thanks, Ginger. I think that's a really important set of work. I think to support this ingredients concept, obviously at scale is going to require some automation. So I was wondering, Chris, with DBOM, can you talk a little bit about automation and how to apply that to this instance and how it could help scale to really support commercial transactions?
Sure. So as Allan said, what we find as we look at this, whether it's software bill of materials, software contents, or the larger picture, that the attestations already exist. We just have to hunt them down and put them back together. Which we've been doing to date. In each software package vulnerability like Ripple 20, all of us as vendors and go back through our stack. We find out we can determine where that code was. The information is there. It's just been spread out. So to automate this, we need several things to come together. We need what Allan and Kate Stewart with the Lions Foundation, Department of Commerce have been fostering, and everybody involved with that in the SBOM communities to have a workable format for that, so that people like Ginger, as she has just said, in that context, in this context, the Department of Energy, critical infrastructures, and so forth, and existing current needs and capabilities to determine fitness for purpose for gear, and from the DBOM perspective, it's putting it all back together. And working for a large integrator, this gets very practical. We need to know where things come from, what we've done with them, what the situation is at our customer. And we can do that because we control those points. And using standard format SBOMs and standard format threat intelligence, which already exists, and our own awareness of what our systems are doing inside a customer network. We can automate that and put those things together. The rise of oracles and smart contracts, we have proof of concepts falling end to end, not just software, but physical hardware, metal from a foundry being cut on a smart plasma table that uses software, which may have an SBOM, deployed and failing, and how do you get that information all back? The automation parts of this, when you have a smart contract, to Edna's point, that defines the relationship we already have. Between Unisys and our customer, we have relationships, we have contracts, we've already agreed what we're going to attest to. As we see in the threat intelligence world, having threat intelligence about your products does not mean you're giving all the information to everybody in the world. The ability to put these in attestation channels and DBOM channels where the relationships between the organizations dictate how that information is shared and how it flows. All of these components have been exercised quite well over the last 10 years and 20 years in many cases. So this evolutionary pressure, again, I believe there is a future point in the relatively near future. There has to be where I can hold a device and say, I know where it's been. I know what software is in it. I know who's been touching it. I know, to extend what Allan's points, not only that while it may have a vulnerability in it, maybe that vulnerability is turned on in that software, but the network around it doesn't carry that port, won't transmit that traffic. We have to be able to put these things together so that we can have operational systems in the competitive and the threat environment that's coming in a very few years. So I see the components of automation with recognizable formats of SBOMs, with recognizable formats of threat intelligence and other bill of material information, provenance in toto, chained together across the relationships of organizations in a formalized attestation system that tracks it.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think the pieces are all there. You're right. Edna, as you alluded to before, you and I have worked on a lot of aspects of information sharing, and you mentioned before that companies have been using a bill of materials approach, internally to determine what's in their products for a long time. How much? Yeah, obviously, this is proprietary information. Depending on how detailed a bill of materials might get, what are companies willing to share? And are we looking at a situation where we have to create multiple levels of detail? But thinking about the specifics of how can we encourage companies to share? Are we going to have a sharing problem if we start to really key in on exchange of bill of materials? What are your thoughts?
So it's a great question to point out the complexity. In concept, having all this information helps you as you run your business without a doubt, and as you deliver to your customers. Having an automated way in which to compile, house, leverage all of that information, and I'm talking about a BOM, so I'm not putting an S or a D or an H in front of it, everything, is essential to your operations. But when you start to move over to the sharing concept, it gets complicated really fast. One, a lot of software and hardware has been customized, number one. Number two, a lot of software and hardware has in fact been changed by the original, I'll call it author or manufacturer, for unique intellectual property aspects from their customer. So you can have a chip, but if it's a chip that's designed by my prior employer, Cisco, I can guarantee you nobody else has that chip. And you can have a chip that's designed by Microsoft and its partner, same partner, they don't look the same. So some of those, and they don't function the same. And we could keep going. So some of what has to be parsed through, and Allan hit on this, which is maybe we don't need that much, we need enough. So step number one is, how much is enough to be meaningful? Let's put it that way, because you can't share everything. And if you do share everything, you may be actually providing a fabulous roadmap to those who would seek to engage in nefarious activity and making it easier for them. So you're actually negating the aspects of ensured quality and security and integrity. So there's a balance. The second thing that makes it complex, I think, is what level, exactly what Allan said, what level of information do you need about what type of software, hardware, etc.? Because not everything is the same. Sometimes things are actually easily turned off, easily controlled, already have control mechanisms within them. So we still need time to sit and think about what criticality means in this context and what level of criticality we need to address. The third area of complexity is, where do we put all this information? Who owns the repository? Who manages the repository? Who ensures that the access and controls are secure? And do we want to limit with whom we share it? Because now you're starting to develop something that has a nation state element rather than just a we're all in it together across the globe. And that makes it even more complex for those of us who are enterprises in particular who operate around the world. So we need I think we need some more thought on that. We have the right concept. The devil is always in the complexity of the implementation. And look, I do think we need some standards. I mean, I know there's ongoing work at the Consortium of Information and Software Quality on the 3TS BOM standard. That has to be aligned with some of the simplistic thoughts about what criticality really means. But this is not easy. And so I would give a caution that I am very encouraged by the focus. I want to allow us time to step back and think about these issues. And I've been debating them and certainly raising them with Allan, who is aware of them from the beginnings, quite frankly, of NTIA talking about this concept. It's a challenge. It's a real challenge. So you've got pieces. We think we know what we want, but we're not sure what we want for each element. We think we have a way of automating, consolidating it. Terrific. But we don't have the answers to whom does it go, who owns it, where does it sit, and how much is enough, and who needs what level of information. So there's opportunity for us to come together as a community, as an industry, and I would argue across international standards to get it right.
If I could chime in, this is what we're very excited about, have been doing for the last almost 3 years now, which is bringing together, right? We've got the leading people from product security, from folks from most of the big tech companies that have been engaging and thinking about this. We have standards, right? There is Cyclone DX comes out of OWASP, SPDX comes out of Linux Foundation, SWID, which is advocated by NIST, is an ISO standard. So I think the solution isn't to create more new standards, but to say, let's take what we have and see what we can do with it. So I want to give sort of 2 quick stories to sort of talk a little about depth, because I think Ed is right. A lot of what we're interested in is at the high level. So for example, when the WannaCry malware was sort of racing across the internet, and in particular targeting the healthcare system, right? If those who may remember, it did incredible damage to the UK health system, shut down providers. People were denied healthcare because of this malware. The head of product security for one of the wealthiest hospitals in America had to pull his staff off the line and call up the vendors of the medical devices to say, hey, does this thing run Windows or Linux? Because they didn't have that visibility. The blinking box that's keeping grandma alive, what operating system does it run? And he likes to tell the story that one of the vendors gave the wrong answer. Said it was Linux, it was Windows, it was vulnerable to the eternal blue vulnerability, and it was not patchable, not because of Microsoft, but because of the manufacturer. So that's information that we need to know. Now, there's some information that we're going to see a lot deeper in. So for example, some researchers a few weeks ago published the name rec vulnerability, which we know is buried very deep in a bunch of IoT and industrial IoT devices. But we also know that while the code is present, the vulnerability isn't exploitable in a lot of these devices. And so that gets to the how do we make sure this information is being used by the right people? And I put it that I think that question gets a little, well, we can look at it a little more rigorously, right? It's 2021, so we can threat model. So our nation state adversaries don't need an SBOM. They don't need a list of ingredients. This stuff is the sort of thing that you can actually find out with a master's degree in computer science if you care about it. And another thing that we're worried about is the distributed automated threats, right? Which also don't need the bill of materials. They're just spray and pray. And one of our working group leads, a guy named Josh Corman, who's been a champion of SBOM for many, many years, back in 2014 and 2015, worked with the Congressional Task Force on Healthcare, has said, we need to give the road, we shouldn't worry so much about the roadmap to the attacker, we should worry about the roadmap to the defender. Now, core of Edna's point, which is how do we make sure that it ends up in the right people? What does that look like? Well, the benefit here is that this is still the private sector. So just as there are existing rules in place that say, hey, sometimes I just publish my documentation, right? So documentation for commercial enterprise software we make public, but a lot of the folks that Ginger works with in the industrial control space, they don't publish that stuff. You've got to have a very specific way, a specific set of contracts before they trust who gets that information. And so I'm less worried about that because there's nothing unique about the commercial relationships that we're dealing with. And what we're going to require. What we do need is some way of doing it at scale, and that's where Chris's DBOM work comes in.
Well, and this is a good transition as well, Allan. So building on what you're talking about, and Edna, your last point, right? This is having gone down the path with threat intelligence, where 10 years ago, for example, people would say, well, the vendors are never going to share their vulnerabilities and whatnot. And now we have ISACs and ISOs and Sticks and Taxi and DHS, the automated indicator sharing system, and it works. In various sectors, that's gotten deeply embedded. Threat intelligence was all over the RSAs a number of years ago, and now it's just a thing. Very similar conversation here, to Edna's point, who gets what information? If I am Unisys, if I'm Microsoft, if I create an SBOM, does that mean I just give my IP to everybody on Earth? Well, probably not. I'll just say no, because speak on behalf of Unisys, we won't do it. Right? But we will share information, and we do share information, as you said, Al, at the end there, normal commercial relationships. We have a relationship with Microsoft, we have a relationship with Dell, we have a relationship with our customers. Those are defined relationships. We share information, we attest to things all the time. And to my point about these inevitably curves coming together, and Edna, your point about repositories, there is no grand central threat intelligence repository where every vulnerability on Earth is all saved. It doesn't work that way. Same way with supply chain information, there may be some central repositories for things. It's certainly not for me to say, but I think what we'll mostly see is repositories being defined by contract relationships, normal commercial relationships that already exist. We see some evolution needed in contract and procurement language. Enterprises need to ask for the right things, and they will find vendors who agree to share that information with them and to perhaps allow them to share that information in certain circumstances with others. And that can be automated, with existing formats, with attestation channels. The DBOM nodes, your attestation firewalls allow you to get involved in channels. On those, you can put SBOMs, you can put contracts, you can read those with oracles, you can have a contract. Edna and our organizations can have a contract that says we can't share your SBOM here unless these things are met, and that can be automated. And the fact that we shared that will be attested to as well. So everybody knows where everything's gotten to. So each of these things are coming from different directions. And the reason that now is the time is that not just that SolarWinds happened, not just that Industry 4.0 is driving the need to automate these for efficiency. It's because the structures have led us to this point. I don't believe 10 years from now we still have these sorts of issues. We kind of have, we can't. So we'll have solved them to a level that reflects existing capabilities and technologies, commercial relationships, contracts, standard formats, and standard ways to track the attestations that people have done what they agreed to do.
Great points. Let me ask one lightning round question before we start to take some questions from the audience. I think what I'm hearing is that this is an idea whose time has come. we're at a point of policy pivot, but boy, there are a lot of details to work through to make this happen. We have some indication, as I think Allan alluded to, DHS has started to talk about SBOMs in their latest policy documentations. We have some, let's say, open source indications that the White House might be getting ready to weigh in and back SBOMs as from a policy standpoint. So if we have some magic policy that says "Thou shalt do" bill of materials, what's the number one thing we need to do to make that happen in the near term? Ginger, let me start with you.
So important in the proof of concept, and I would not be doing a service to my co-chair, Tom Ulrich, if I did not say education is the primary thing we need to do. We need to develop a way to help vendors understand what it means to produce a well-qualified SBOM and HBOM. As Edna said, how much information is sufficient and which audiences receive which information. HBOM gets more complicated because that changes as the product development lifecycle goes along, and these two BOMs have different intertwining points. So all of this complexity, the IP issues around it, the technical issues in producing, consuming, wresting meaning out of all of this information, education around all of that, and helping the community experiment safely and come to a place where they are guided by standards and supported by policy to produce good, transparent information about products to help with risk management.
Great, thanks. So education, a vote for education. Edna, what do you think the number one priority thing we need to do to work is?
Figure out what the ingredients are that need to go in the SBOM box.
Okay, great answer. Allan, what do you think?
I think the challenge right now that I see is we know how to create SBOMs. We're going to share them. I'd like to see more progress in how to consume them at scale. So how do we make sure that the people who are intaking them and using them for these use cases like supply chain risk management or vulnerability management, those aren't things that we need to reinvent. Let's work on folding them into our tools and our capacity and our frameworks. And if we can do it without regulation, great. We've seen some leadership, but a lot of leadership comes in the spaces that are being regulated. So I'd love to see more industry leadership as well.
Okay, Chris, what do you think is the next priority thing to do to make all of this come together, all those pieces that you talked about?
So since I agree with all three of the first comments, I'll talk about commercialization, right? The world is changing in the supply chain, whether we like it or not, and our choices will determine whether we win or lose. From a commercial perspective, as we see in the energy sector and regulated sectors, it may be a really good choice as a vendor or consumer and give you a competitive advantage to be better, faster, cheaper, to move forward with this faster. And same with the solution providers behind it that'll provide the infrastructure. Moving those forward so that the business interest, so it's not just standards and regulations being forced. I believe that there is an enormous amount of efficiency to be gained through all of this that's going to give people lower prices and faster response times. So getting that commercial engine into it so that people do these things because it's part of their business model since we're talking about the near term, I think in this calendar you're demonstrating a couple of those. You actually save money. You get a better competitive process by doing things right. That will drive acceleration of adoption.
Yeah, great points. Fantastic, everybody. Let's take a question that we received from the audience. Joshua Sipper asks, what types of technologies or systems could be used to manage the massive amounts of information included in this concept? Would capabilities such as blockchain, Kubernetes, and the like help out? Any thoughts?
I'll take that one. So I touched on this a moment ago. So the digital bill of materials is an attestation ecosystem with an open source foundation. Anybody can do it, and it dictates nothing. It allows actors, any of us or organizations, to create attestation repositories that could be blockchain or not, have those characteristics to them, and do things with them. When we talk about the massive piles of information, my company, Edna's company, the U.S. government has massive information, but I think most of this breaks down into relatively smaller chunks. The information that I, as Unisys, want to share with my ClearPath forward mainframe customers is a relatively defined set. I don't, to the point of sharing and policy I touched on earlier, it may be that all of the information from Microsoft that is shared with Unisys could be part of that, but all of it isn't. Most of it will never get pulled in. So the actual volume of information between myself, large integrator, and a large customer is much more finite than the entire possible pool of all information. It's the ability to chain that together. So if I, as an integrator, have made a commitment, have attested to a commitment, a contract to a customer, those conditions are met, and they include, I now get to go back upstream and pull in SBOMs or other information, with the pre-existing agreements of my partners. That's how we end up parsing. It's how the web works and how the internet works. There is no. This has come up a number of times over the decades. If there's going to be this big central, and there really isn't going to be a big central repository of all this, it'll parse out between relationships and organizations.
I will add that there are some folks who have been advocating loudly for some central repositories, but I think that's going to be quite some time before we move in that direction, and a lot of concerns like those that Edna raised also come from that flag. One thing I will also try to underscore is that we're not proposing to invent anything brand new. You can think of this as enrichment on what we already have, right? Most mature organizations already have an asset management solution, right? And by the way, if you don't have an asset management solution, please stop watching this webcast right now and go spend the next 10 minutes working on that. Sorry, Cheri. Right, that really should be a priority from Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Once we have that, this is going to be the next layer down, right? Not only do I know what blinking boxes I have on my very important network, but now I know what's inside them. And this is where we want to say, hey, let's add on and build on the data structures and the marketplace that we already have today, rather than trying to say this is something brand new.
I'm going to jump in and say, I think storage is a big issue that needs to be solved. But one of the things I'm looking forward to, anticipating, excited about, is the renaissance of opportunity available for making meaning out of these SBOMs and HBOMs. One of the programs that I'm excited about that DOE has started called Cymani actually is combining ideas for cybersecurity with ideas for responsible energy usage. And I'm sitting and thinking about, if I understood the SBOM and the HBOM down to the chip, the integrated circuit level, how could I best manage the energy investments that I'm making across my infrastructure? How would this information help me do so? So I would say the thing that I would excite people about, once you spend your 10 minutes getting your asset management system, think about, originate a new idea for how you might make meaning out of this information, because there are a lot of opportunities for new products and new research in that area.
So I'll follow on that and say, I think, look, containers and blockchain are great, and they're here today and we can utilize them. But in terms of being able to actually swiftly deal with the reality of what will be a growing body of content requires three things. And it's three things that don't necessarily relate specifically to software. One, we had best get our arms wrapped around the capacity to actually do liquid cooling for high performance compute, because we're going to need it. And 5G is going to get us there too. Two, we had best continue our efforts, and we are mightily doing it jointly across academia, the government, and enterprise, to get to quantum. It frees up the power of data mining capacity to get to Ginger's ask, which is, how are we going to leverage, access, and make sense of all of this data swiftly in a meaningful fashion? So never again would anybody ask the question that Allan posed to some companies, because if you are asked the question, and do you use solar winds and where do you use it, and you don't know, that's a challenge that would require a lot of whiskey for me to have that conversation, because you should know that in this day and age. But if you don't, this is our opportunity to help one another. And I think the third thing we have to do is change the lens on what constitutes a product cert alert. And we could, if we had this information, in addition to sharing it enterprise to enterprise in the way that you heard Chris talk about, actually get to the point where what we push out is not just vulnerability information, but saying, this has happened. Here's where it was utilized. Here's what we're doing about it. And we wanted to share that with you. Will we get there publicly? Interesting debate, but we have to be able to get to the point where we can do it before we debate with whom we share it.
Those are great points, all. I'd throw in kind of reference architecture where things might exist in the system, also really helpful. I have one more, I think we have time for one more question, and it is from Abraham George. For example, a director of product development in a business or company, for such a person, what mechanism do you envision to make their life easier when selecting software or hardware? So how does this translate into practical decision making for the folks that are procuring hardware and software?
So I've mentioned procurement language already. I think that almost all enterprises have a little bit of work to do on that. Put requirements in. If your procurement organization, your procurement language doesn't say, provide me, contents and SBOMs and so forth, and that's an area to look at a great deal. The matching your customer requirements to your upstream in that question, Ibrahim, here. I'm using other people's software to build a product. Start requiring SBOMs, start building that into your process. I think Allan and probably has more tactical advice, perhaps, that I do for a product manager.
So one thing that we announced yesterday at NTIA's spring meeting on SBOM is trying to address exactly this question, where the head of product security for a very large energy manufacturer said, people ask us for an SBOM, and that's not enough. You can't just say, give us an SBOM, because that's not something I can deliver on contractually. And so the community produced a sort of options menu that says, here's sort of the consensus vision on things like depth and the fields. And by the way, if you are a high assurance user, you can ask for more. And if you have a legacy system or it's very difficult or costly, you can downgrade it as well. And I think that's going to be a key resource that we'd love some feedback on moving forward.
So I have a slightly different view, which is I don't think procurement language helps you at all. Contracts shift risk. They don't drive anything else. So if you're relying on your contract to get the information and relationship and partnership you need from your third parties, you've already failed. I would argue that what you really need as a product manager is a conversation with the third party before you make the decision to understand how do they measure supply chain risk in their own environment, and how do they secure their supply chain and understand that, and can they give you that visibility in terms of their architecture and the steps that they're taking. That might be a differentiator among those who you're considering for any particular purchase. And then I think the second thing that I would consider is, as you evaluate that down the road, can you actually get them to assist you in information sharing? Because even if we have all of this in a DBOM, mining it may require a little bit of help from he or she or they who actually know the information at the level of how they utilized it. And I'll give you an example. IoT, big issue for all of us, particularly in OT, as we use more of it. We're thinking about it, and we might say, well, this is an issue, and it's hit these particular sensors, sensor X. Boy, sensor X is used in the energy sector. It's used on factory floors. It's used in a variety of ways. If you knew, for example, that sensor X actually had a chip in it that was a chip enabled by some technology, I'll be biased and say our Azure Sphere, you would have a different set of risks. You would move on to the next one. So that's where the visibility comes into play. You need to understand not just what the elements of that BOM are, but what in heaven's name they do for you. And do they address a risk so you can move on to the next one?
Yep. I think, Edna, you're spot on in calling out a lot of the challenges here. We are at time for today, so I think this is a fascinating area. I think as all of the panelists have alluded to, we're going to see more to come in this bill of materials approach, but a lot of details to work out to make it commercially viable to really meet the need that we're trying to address with illuminating supply chain security. So I want to give a huge thanks to the expert panel here today. All of you just have tremendous perspectives, and thank you for sharing them here today. And thanks everybody for watching, and have a great weekend.